Hi, welcome back. The security problems with voting by voice that we just talked about really became apparent even to people at the time. And there were calls from pretty early on to replace voting by voice with something else. And that something else was the paper ballot. In France, in the 1795 Constitution, there was a demand for voting by ballot. In England, the People's Charter in 1838 also called for the introduction of voting by ballot. And in the U.S., voting with ballots was gradually introduced in jurisdictions throughout the early 1800s. Let's take a look at some of the technology behind voting by ballots. So voting using ballots is an idea that goes all the way back to ancient Greece, where for certain elections, voters would vote by depositing different colors of stones or of pot shards into an urn. That idea of voting on a physical object using physical tokens carried on into more modern times. Here we see an example of a ballot box that involves tokens that are actually colored balls. And the word ballot comes from the Italian word ballotta, meaning little ball, just like this. Now, this particular voting device wasn't actually used in elections for public office. It was used in a private club for elections of new applicants for membership. And each existing member of the club got a black ball and a white ball and would deposit one or the other into this box depending on whether they liked the new person. This is where the term black ball comes from, to blackball someone, to veto their membership, for instance, would be an actual operation with a black ball in a ballot box like this. So for elections, ballots typically consisted of pieces of paper. And those ballot papers and the ballot box into which they were inserted were some of the earliest forms of technology used by voting. Voting by voice, we didn't really need any technology other than paper and pen to record voters' choices. Now, voting with the ballot required the introduction of polling technology. So let's see some of the features with this particular form of voting technology, the ballot box. This early ballot box from about 1870 contains a lock, so you could insert a key to make sure that no one could open it up and remove the ballots. At the beginning of the polls, the election would start by actually unlocking it and opening it to show that the box was empty. Then they'd lock it, and voters would proceed to walk up to the box and cast their votes. To cast a vote, you take your ballot and just put it into the slot here. Voters initially had to provide their own ballots. And the earliest form was just a scrap of paper on which you wrote by hand the names of the candidates you wanted to vote for. Now, after all the voters had inserted their ballots into the box, the officials would either open it up and count it in front of people right there at the polling place, or if it was going to be counted somewhere else, they might try to seal the ballot box, placing something over the slot, say a wax seal, to prevent more ballots from being inserted. So this was the essence of the ballot box technology in its earliest form. We can also look at what a count might look like. And this illustration shows the counting process on paper ballots and a wooden ballot box. We can see several features of the process that have security implications. So here we see that there's one man whose job it is to remove each ballot from the box and call off the names for each office. Then there are clerks, once again, as in voice voting, writing down each choice and tallying them up. Also, there are observers in the background who are watching that the right name is read and the right thing is written down. So there are some security implications even to this simple arrangement. You can see that the man who is reading the ballots doesn't have a writing implement to make it more difficult for him to, say, change what's on the ballot. Similarly, the observers are from multiple different parties or levels of government, as well as members of the public standing in the back. All of this is introducing multiple security mechanisms to try to safeguard the integrity of the vote. Now, it's time to ask one more time, what could go wrong? So again, try applying the security mindset and what you know about voting on paper ballots, and think about what might be some of the problems with this system as it was adopted in its earliest forms. It turns out that there's quite a lot that could go wrong with these early applications of paper ballots. The technology was designed to provide integrity and a form of protection for ballot secrecy. But if the procedures weren't followed quite right, or if people trying to violate the security of the election were clever enough, there were many ways in which this would fail. One example of a way that the security could be violated is procedural. If the procedures weren't followed precisely, lots could go wrong. For instance, it would be quite common to try to exclude those observers that we see in the background here in this idealistic depiction of counting. And in that case, the counters could just announce whatever result they wanted. Another place where plenty could go wrong was in the design of the ballot and the ballot box themselves. These technologies, introduced for the first time with paper ballots, created new kinds of opportunities for fraud. Let's look at some of those now. So this is really an extraordinary picture I'm showing you now. This is an example of a real dishonest ballot box. Then this was used to cheat by criminals in a real election in San Francisco around 1856. Here's one example of what can go wrong. Someone can be replacing the honest ballot box with a cheater's ballot box like this. So let's look at how this design works. This is incredibly clever. The ballot box has a false bottom and a false side. And before the election, the cheaters will fill out a bunch of ballots for the candidates they want to win and hide them behind the false bottom and false side inside the box. With the bottom and side in place, it looks like the box is empty. But after the election, if the cheaters have a few minutes alone with it, they can slide out that bottom panel and that side panel and turn the box upside down and shake it around, thereby mixing their fake ballots that they had in from the beginning in with all the other ballots. This is incredibly clever and could be quite effective. It was only caught because people suspected that such things were going on and did a very careful examination after the election. As if those problems weren't enough, the cheaters had another way to cheat, and we'll see more about how this applies even in modern voting machines. It turned out that the lock on the ballot box was also just not very good, and by applying pressure in the right way, you could cause it to open without the key. So fraud like this motivated several innovations in ballot box design. Here's one example, the glass ballot box. This was introduced to make it easier to check that the ballot box was empty and harder to incorporate false sides or false bottoms. Some more advanced designs for the glass ballot box basically had the votes in a glass sphere, so you could tell even that the bottom of the box was not fake. Now, this kind of transparency, in this case literally, but also symbolically and conceptually, turns out to be a major kind of security mechanism we see in voting again and again. It's just really, really important for voters to be able to confirm directly with their senses that everything is being done fairly and honestly. But ballot box transparency can't guarantee that all the votes that have been cast will eventually be counted. And that's part of the idea behind this other invention, the registering ballot box, as it's called. Now, this was the first time that a machine, a mechanism, was introduced into the voting process. The registering ballot box had a crank and gears inside. So you would insert a ballot and turn the crank. And this would do two things. First, it would ring a bell that would announce to everyone that a vote had been inserted into the box. And second, it would increment a counter on the front of the box. This counter was in public view and would let anyone observing know how many votes had actually been inserted into the box. This was a check against ballot box stuffing and also a protection for the counting process, because you'd have to make sure that you could then make sure that the total number of votes that had been counted at the end of the day wasn't greater or less than the number of ballots that had been inserted into the box. If that happened, it was reason to raise the alarm. In many ways, these modern ballot box designs you see here are a step backwards from these ingenious, transparent and registering ballot boxes from the 1800s. But they reflect other kinds of trade-offs in the election process. The cardboard ballot box on the left was disposable. So there was no need to store them between the elections, and it was very easy to just have on hand enough in case you had unexpectedly high voter turnout. The metal ballot box on the right is a different set of trade-offs. This is probably more secure than a wooden one for multiple reasons, but including that it has a metal tab at the top through which you can attach a padlock. And they could use arbitrarily strong locks, different locks in each election. It presented another opportunity for a security enhancement. In addition to the design of the ballot box, the design of the ballots themselves was something that had a great number of security features as well as opportunities for mischief. Candidates quickly realized that it was easier for the voter if they could bring a ballot that had the candidate's name already written on it, printed in advance. And so to show you this example, this is one of the earliest examples of a pre-printed ballot. We see at the top here, the candidate who paid to have these ballots printed has his name already written in there. But there are slots for all the other offices for the voter to write in his choices or her choices with a pen. Now, this particular ballot you can see is torn on the left and the bottom. It was probably printed in a newspaper as an advertisement, a little free reminder of who you wanted to vote for. Now, the design of these ballots evolved quite a bit throughout the 1800s. Here we see 1880. We've gone from having a ballot that was just sponsored by an individual candidate to one that's sponsored by a party that has all of the party's choices for the different races written in at the printers. This is the origin of the term party ticket. A party ticket, or the slate of candidates that a party is putting forward, was originally literally a printed piece of paper, a ticket, that the voter would take and put into the ballot box. This ballot, both of these actually show one other interesting feature that separates U.S. elections from elections in most of the rest of the world, which is that we can have a staggering number of different questions on the ballot at the same time. National races, state races, local races, as well as referenda. And all of that vastly complicates voting technology, as we'll see later. But in this case, you can see in the ballot on the left, the questions the voter is being asked to fill in include who they want for surveyor and coroner in their local jurisdiction. Now, the Republican ticket you see in the middle, this party ticket, is an early example, and it still has enough room between the choices so that if you like most of the party's choices but not all of them, you can just cross some of them out and write in your own. But a few years later, we see how this has evolved. The parties wised up to the fact that they were making it super easy for people to not follow all of their choices. So they decided to make it harder. These new design ballots left no room at all between the different candidates. It would be very, very hard to squeeze in your own choice there. They're just trying to make it less convenient for people to split the ticket and write in candidates of their choice rather than the party's. It's all or nothing. You can see there's just one office at the bottom here where the party didn't have a pick, and so they've left it blank for the voter to fill in. Another problem that this kind of ticket introduced that's really quite interesting is that sometimes rival candidates would print their own version of the party ticket that didn't have the party's own official choices on it. It would be replacing one of the choices with the candidate's own name, but still claiming to be the real party ticket. And this sort of thing introduced a lot of voter confusion. But there was no reason at the time for it to be against the law. After all, maybe the voter really intended to vote for that candidate. But there was a lot of trickery like that in the 1800s, and the non-standard design of the ballots like these just multiplied the opportunities for it. Let me give you a couple of other examples of places where nefarious innovations chipped away at the integrity and especially the secrecy provided by the paper ballot. In some cases, as in this Union Party ticket, a party would print a large sheet of multiple ballots all together, and it was up to the voter to tear them out. This just invited voters to try to vote multiple times, or to try to put multiple pieces of paper into the ballot box at the same time. Multiple voting, or repeating as it was called, was a huge security problem in the 1800s. And this is part of what motivated the adoption of voter registration systems, which would make sure that the voter's name was on a particular list and then cross it out after the voter voted. So that was a security innovation in response to problems like this. Another nefarious ballot characteristic was printing your party's ballot on a distinctive color or kind of paper. As you can see here with this, this party ballot from 1860. So if the ballot for the party was on a particular color, then people standing around at the polling place could still check that you were voting for the right party and not for their opponents. This greatly reduced the amount of privacy that the ballot could provide. Furthermore, it represents a trade-off in technologies like the glass ballot box. So if you have a glass ballot box, it's easier to see whether you've falsely inserted 2 tickets, and easier to make sure that the ballot box was empty at the beginning. But it's also then impossible for you to conceal the color of the ballot paper as you're inserting it, even if you've kept it hidden until you got up to the ballot box. So all of these forms of tricks gradually eroded the promise of increased secrecy and integrity that paper ballots were initially thought to provide. And it took more innovations before the system could be perfected. We'll hear about that in the next segment.